wet pine and damp earth. My brother Jake and I had been hiking through Olympic National Park for 3 days, deep in the old-growth forest where the trees towered like ancient sentinels. The weather had been mild, but the forecast warned of an approaching storm. We didn't think much of it until the sky turned the color of bruised flesh and the first cold drops began to fall. By nightfall, the rain was relentless. It drummed against the leaves like 1,000 whispering fingers, and the wind howled through the branches, making them creak and groan like something alive. We pitched our tent in a small clearing, hoping the dense canopy would shield us from the worst of it. But the storm had other plans. I remember waking up around midnight to the sound of Jake's voice. "Hey, come out here." It was soft, almost playful, the way he'd sound when he was about to prank me. But Jake was still asleep beside me, his breathing slow and steady. I sat up, my heart hammering. The rain had eased slightly, but the forest was still alive with noise, dripping water, rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. Then I heard it again. "I found something. You gotta see this." This time, it came from outside the tent. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent flap, the cold air biting my skin. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the rain-slicked ferns and gnarled roots. Nothing moved. "Jake!" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer. Then, a snap of a twig. I swung the light toward the sound. The underbrush trembled, but there was no animal, no figure. Just the forest, watching me. I turned back to the tent, ready to wake Jake and tell him we needed to leave, when I heard his voice again. "Turn around." This time, it was right behind me. I spun, my breath catching in my throat. The beam of my flashlight trembled in my grip, sweeping over the trees. And then, a giggle. Not Jake's laugh. Something wrong. High-pitched, guttural, like a child's voice filtered through broken glass. I lunged back into the tent and shook Jake awake. "We need to go. Now." He groaned, rubbing his eyes. What? Something's out there," I hissed. It's mimicking you." The moment I said it, the forest went silent. No rain, no wind, just absolute stillness. Then knock, knock, knock. 3 slow, deliberate taps on the tent pole. Jake's face drained of color. We didn't speak. We didn't breathe. We just moved. We tore down the tent in seconds, shoving our gear into our packs with shaking hands. The entire time, I could feel it watching us from the trees. Then, as we turned to leave, Jake's voice rang out again, but this time it was everywhere. "Don't run. I just want to play." We bolted. The rain had turned the trail into a slick, muddy river, and we slipped and stumbled as we ran. Behind us, the forest came alive. Branches cracked. Leaves rustled. Something was keeping pace with us, just out of sight. At one point, I dared to look back. Between the trees, for just a second, I saw a shape. Tall, thin, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. And then it smiled. We didn't stop running until we reached the ranger station at dawn, our clothes soaked, our lungs burning. The ranger listened to our story with a grim expression. When we mentioned the voice, he exhaled sharply. "You're not the first," he said. "There's something in these woods that learns. It listens. And when it has your voice, that's when it tries to lure you in." He refused to say more, but his hands were shaking. We never went back. But sometimes on stormy nights, I still hear it. A whisper, a giggle, and the sound of something knocking at my door. The Olympic rainforest is ancient, and some things that are older than the trees. They watch, they learn, and when it rains, they come out to play. Would you answer if you heard your name in the dark? The car's headlights cut through the thick mist as we approached the forest's edge. The GPS had been glitching for the last 20 kilometers, the screen flickering between our location and static. Laura tapped the dashboard impatiently. "This thing's useless," she muttered, before switching it off completely. We were relying on printed maps now. The kind you couldn't trust when the road suddenly ended in an overgrown path that didn't match any of the contours. We parked beside a weather-beaten signpost, its red warning symbols barely visible under layers of moss and grime. As I stepped out, my boots sank into the mud with a sickening squelch. The air smelled wrong, not just damp earth and pine, but something metallic underneath like old blood. A crow cawed from a nearby tree, its beady eyes tracking our movements. Lara stretched, rolling her shoulders. "This is it," she said, her breath visible in the suddenly chilly air. "The most haunted forest in the world." She pulled out her DSLR and snapped a photo of the sign. When we checked it later, the letters appeared to be bleeding in the image. We hiked about half a kilometer in before finding a suitable clearing. The trees here grew in unnatural spirals, their trunks twisted like broken spines. The ground was suspiciously bare. No undergrowth, no insects, just hard-packed earth that felt spongy underfoot. As we pitched our tent, I noticed the silence first. No birds, no wind, just the occasional drip of rainwater from the leaves above. The storm hit just as we finished securing the rainfly. One moment, it was drizzling. The next, it was a torrential downpour that turned the forest floor into a shallow river. Lightning flashed, and in that split second of illumination, I saw something move between the trees, something that stood too straight, its limbs too long. When the darkness returned, there was only the sound of the rain. Around 11 p.m., our equipment started malfunctioning. The EMF detector spiked erratically, the needle slamming into the red zone before dropping dead. Our walkie-talkies crackled with static, through which we could just make out whispering voices speaking rapid Romanian. The worst was the thermal camera. Every few minutes, it would show humanoid shapes standing just beyond our campsite, figures that weren't visible to the naked eye. Lara was fascinated. "This is incredible," she breathed, adjusting the camera settings. "The activity is off the charts tonight." She didn't seem to notice how the temperature in the tent had dropped, how our breath now came out in visible puffs despite it being late summer. It started softly at first, a woman's voice humming a lullaby. The melody was familiar, something from my childhood that I couldn't quite place. Lara's head snapped up. "You hear that too, right?" I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. The singing grew louder, coming from multiple directions now, harmonizing with itself in impossible ways. When I checked the thermal camera, my blood ran cold. Dozens of heat signatures surrounded our tent, standing motionless in the pouring rain. They shouldn't have been there. They couldn't be there. Yet the screen showed them clear as day, human-shaped, but wrong, their heat patterns inconsistent with living bodies. "I'm going to get audio of this," Lara announced, grabbing her recorder. Before I could stop her, she'd unzipped the tent and stepped out into the storm. I watched through the mesh as her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating sheets of rain. The singing stopped abruptly. Then Lara screamed. Not a shout of surprise, a raw, primal sound of terror that cut off mid-cry. Her flashlight clattered to the ground, still on, casting long shadows between the trees. I saw something then, a silhouette too tall, its arms outstretched in what might have been a welcoming gesture or a threat. Then the flashlight died, plunging everything into darkness. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed with fear. Eventually, I forced myself to move, grabbing my own flashlight and the hunting knife I'd brought for protection. The rain had lessened to a drizzle, but the forest was alive with sounds, creaking branches, skittering movements in the underbrush, and that damned singing again, now coming from directly above me. Lara's equipment lay scattered near a particularly twisted oak. Her backpack was torn open, the contents strewn about. Most disturbing was her journal. The last page contained frantic scribbles. They're not ghosts, there's something else they watch from the trees they dash. The rest was illegible, the paper torn as if by claws. When the police arrived at dawn, they moved with the weary efficiency of people who'd done this before. The lead officer, a grizzled man with deep-set eyes, barely reacted when I showed him the thermal footage. "Hoya Bachu takes many," he said simply, lighting a cigarette. "Most we never find." They discovered 3 things of note. Fresh scratches on several trees at exactly 7 feet high, a patch of earth that resisted all attempts to dig into it. Lara's phone, buried in the roots of the twisted oak, still recording the video, showed nothing but darkness and labored breathing for 47 minutes. Then, right before the battery died, a whisper, "They're showing me the way out. There's so many of us here." I left Romania 2 days later, but Hoia Baciu didn't let me go that easily. For months afterward, I'd wake at 3:17 a.m. to the sound of Romanian lullabies coming from my closet. My devices would glitch, showing brief glimpses of Lara's face in the static. The final straw came when my security camera captured a figure standing at the foot of my bed, its limbs too long, its face featureless except for a too wide smile. I moved, changed my number, burned all the equipment we'd used that night. But sometimes when it rains particularly hard, I'll catch a whiff of that metallic forest smell. And if I listen very carefully, I can almost hear Lara's voice mingling with the others, singing that damned lullaby. They say Hoia Baciu doesn't just take people, it assimilates them. That somewhere in those twisted woods, Lara is still walking, still recording, still waiting to show others the way out, the way in. I'll never forget how the trees seemed to close in behind us as we drove deeper into the Black Forest. Our headlights reflected off thousands of raindrops suspended in the fog, creating the illusion of eyes watching from the darkness. The GPS had failed completely now, displaying only the words recalculating in blood-red letters before shutting off with an electronic whimper. Sarah clutched my arm as we hit another pothole. "Are you sure this is the right road?" Her voice was tight with tension. I wasn't sure of anything anymore. The rental car's clock kept flickering between 7:23 p.m. and 3:17 a.m., the numbers distorting like melting wax. When we finally found the cabin, my first thought was that it looked like a rotten tooth jutting from the earth. The wooden beams weren't just weathered. They were blackened, as if scorched from within. The front porch sagged dangerously, and I noticed the welcome mat was actually a rusted metal grate, its patterns forming symbols that made my eyes water if I stared too long. The key was where the owner said it would be, beneath a moss-covered log crawling with centipedes. But as I reached for it, I felt something brush against my fingers. Not insects, something cold and fibrous like damp hair. I jerked back, but when I looked again, there was nothing there. The interior smelled like wet newspapers and spoiled meat. Sarah pretended not to notice, humming nervously as she inspected the bedrooms. I checked the fuse box and found something strange. All the breakers were labeled in neat German, except one. That one bore a crude carving of an eye, the pupil drilled deep into the metal. When I flipped it experimentally, every light in the cabin dimmed to a sickly orange hue. From the basement came a wet, shuffling sound. Sarah called from the kitchen. "Did you hear that?" I lied and said no. The storm reached its peak as we lay in bed. Rain hammered the roof like frantic fists, and the wind howled through cracks we hadn't noticed before. Then came the first knock, so heavy it shook the front door in its frame. 3 precise impacts. Knock, knock, knock. Sarah's grip on my arm turned vice-like. "There's someone out there," she whispered. I reached for my phone, but the screen showed only static. Then the knocking moved. It came from the living room window next, the glass vibrating with each strike. When I shone my flashlight, the beam illuminated a handprint forming in the condensation. Except it had 6 fingers, the extra digit curling obscenely against the glass. I grabbed the fireplace poker, its weight-cold comfort. The knocking now circled the cabin with methodical precision. Front door, living room window, kitchen door, bedroom window. Always the same rhythm. Always pausing just long enough for hope to bloom before starting again. Sarah called the police while I checked the security peephole. The storm-lashed clearing appeared empty until lightning flashed. That's when I saw it, a figure standing perfectly still in the downpour. Tall, thin, wearing what looked like a tattered raincoat, several sizes too large. Its face. The peephole distorted the image, but I could swear its mouth was moving, forming words I couldn't hear. Then it tilted its head at an impossible angle and raised one elongated hand toward the door. The officers found nothing outside, but their flashlights kept flickering unnaturally. The younger cop kept glancing at the roof, his hand never far from his service weapon. Probably just the storm, the senior officer said, but his eyes told a different story. They widened when he examined the claw marks, 5 deep grooves in the wood, plus one shallower cut, as if whatever made them had a sixth finger it didn't quite know how to use. As they left, I heard the younger cop mutter in German, "Wieder die Naxer." When I asked what that meant, he just shook his head. We should have left then, but exhaustion won out. As Sarah slept fitfully, I noticed something I'd missed before, a trapdoor in the hallway, nearly invisible beneath layers of grime. The smell hit me first, damp earth and spoiled milk. The stairs groaned under my weight as I descended into blackness. My phone's flashlight revealed shelves lined with mason jars, each containing what looked like hair. Different colors, different textures, all carefully labeled with dates going back to 1947. The most recent jar was only half full. The label read December 10th, 2021, tomorrow's date. Epilogue. 1 month later, the email arrived at exactly 3:17 a.m. No subject line, just an attachment showing our bedroom window from outside. The figure stood there again, its raincoat now unmistakably familiar. It was wearing my missing jacket, the one I'd lost that night. But the worst part? In the reflection of the glass, barely visible behind the creature, I could see myself still inside the cabin, still sleeping next to Sarah. And we weren't alone in that bed. What the locals know after returning home, I researched Naxer. The term translates to after-devourer, a type of German revenant that knocks on doors during storms. According to folklore, you must never answer before the third knock, unless you invite it inside to replace you. The cabin's owner finally responded to my emails last week. His reply consisted of a single sentence. Nobody has rented that cabin since 1983.